Only 4 years had passed since the end of the Revolutionary War, yet during the hot summer of 1787, leaders of the state were already meeting to discuss a dramatic change in the government. In 1776, during the Revolutionary War, they had written a document called the Articles of Confederation. It explained how the government of the colonies would be organized and how laws would be made. After the war, it became clear that the government described in the Articles would not work for the new nation. It was the responsibility of these leaders, including George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, George Mason, and Benjamin Franklin, to agree on how the government of the newly formed United States should be run. The Constitutional Convention lasted from May until September 1787. During that time, the leaders discussed many important ideas and issues. In their discussions, they sought to answer many questions, such as who should have more power, how should presidents be elected, how should leaders in Congress be elected, and who should have the right to vote. For each of these questions and all the others that were talked about at the convention, there were many different answers and opinions. After much debate, however, a consensus or agreement was made on many of them. The delegates' final agreement became known as the U.S. Constitution. Most of the important questions were agreed upon before the Constitution was finished. Surprisingly, one big question was not, should the Constitution protect the rights of the people? All the leaders at the convention agreed that the rights of the people should be protected. After all, a democracy is, by definition, a government for and of the people. It was because England's King George III abused the rights of the colonists during the rule that they had sought independence during the Revolutionary War. Two opposing groups had strong opinions about why the rights of the people should or should not be in the Constitution. One group of leaders, called Federalists, did not think it was necessary to include a list of rights in the Constitution. In fact, the Federalists feared that by including some rights and not others, the government could actually limit the rights of the people. Another group of leaders, called the Anti-Federalists, believed the opposite. They felt that if the rights were listed in the Constitution, then the government would have the power to take away these rights at any time. By listing them in the Constitution, the rights of the people would be guaranteed and protected. Most people in the country agreed with the second group of leaders. They remembered what it felt like to have limited rights under King George's rule, and they didn't want that to happen to them again. They wanted a Bill of Rights included in the Constitution. When the Constitution was sent to the states for ratification, many of the states voiced this opinion. New York, Massachusetts, and Virginia said they wanted a Bill of Rights. They even came up with their own list of suggestions for the delegates to include. North Carolina and Rhode Island believed so strongly that the Constitution should have a Bill of Rights that they would not approve the Constitution at all unless one was added. Although James Madison was a Federalist, he was also a great writer. Because of this, he was placed on the committee to write the Bill of Rights. Madison looked at many documents when he wrote his list of rights. He wanted to get ideas for what was important to people in his day and in the past. One was the Magna Carta, which was written in England in 1215. Another was the English Bill of Rights, which was written in 1689. He also looked at the lists that were written by some of the states, such as the Virginia Declaration of Rights, written by George Mason in 1776. All these documents helped Madison come up with a list of rights that he thought would be important to the people of the United States. By the time Congress met in 1789, Madison had a list of 17 rights. The leaders in Congress talked about each one. They decided whether each was important or not, and if it was, why it was important. Finally, after talking about the list of the entire summer of 1789, Congress had agreed on 12 amendments to be added to the Constitution. Before anything could be added to the Constitution, though, it had to be approved by the states. The delegates took the list to each of their state legislators, where the amendments were debated again. In the end, not all 12 amendments were approved. The original amendments 1 and 2 were rejected. New Jersey was the first state to approve the 10 amendments, and Virginia was the 11th, the last one needed for ratification. These first 10 amendments to the Constitution have been known ever since as the Bill of Rights. Only 11 states needed to approve the Bill of Rights for it to be ratified. Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Georgia did not vote to ratify the document until 1939, when the Bill of Rights was 150 years old. Vermont had become a state less than a year before ratification. Have you ever wondered what it might be like to live in a place where you are only allowed to say, do, and believe things that a government agreed with? Believe it or not, many people today live in places that are like this. The First Amendment in the Bill of Rights gives U.S. citizens the right to speak, write, worship, and assemble without fear of punishment. In October 2010, a woman in China added a comment and retweeted her fiancé's Twitter post. He had written about a Chinese protest against Japan. She had jokingly added the words, "Charge angry youth." 11 days later, on the day they had planned to marry, both the woman and her fiancé were arrested. The fiancé was released 5 days later, but the woman was sentenced to 1 year in a labor camp. Her crime, disturbing social stability. And it is in this exact type of situation that the framers of the Constitution feared. They did not ever want the U.S. government to have the ability to limit the things people can say. In order to protect the right of freedom of speech, they included that in the First Amendment of the Constitution. Freedom of speech is just one of the rights protected by the First Amendment. Other rights include freedom of religion, freedom to worship, freedom to assemble peacefully, and freedom to make a complaint against the government. One of the reasons early settlers moved from Europe to North America was for freedom of religion. The Pilgrims, for example, were not allowed to practice their religion freely in England. If they did, they faced persecution and sometimes imprisonment. They left their homes and braved the dangers of the New World so that they could worship without fear of punishment. Quakers came to Pennsylvania, a colony that William Penn set up for them in 1682. Many Catholics settled in Maryland because Lord Baltimore had founded the colony to protect those who believed in that faith. The First Amendment actually protects several ideas associated with freedom of religion. First, it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. This means that the U.S. government cannot make laws about religion. It also means that the government cannot make a state religion to say that everyone must follow a certain religion. The second part says, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This simply means that the government cannot keep people from practicing their religion. The Constitution lets people believe in whatever religion they want to, and it protects people who don't want to practice any religion at all, because the government may not interfere with religious worship. The United States enjoys separation of church and state. Freedom of the press refers to the printing press. It is the freedom to print people's ideas in magazines, newspapers, books, and other forms of media. People in the United States can read different ideas and viewpoints in newspapers or on the internet. They can listen to news reporters describing events on television. Since things have always been that way in the United States, it may not sound like it's an important right, but there are many cases where people who have not had this right have suffered. For example, just 1 month after Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany, the lives of Germans began to change. It was February 1933, and a fire had broken out in an important government building. Even though no one knew for sure who had started the fire, the Nazis believed it was a group of communists trying to take over the government. Hitler and the other Nazi leaders said they had to act quickly to protect Germany and its people. They changed the country's constitution and took away the civil liberties of the German people. Germans could no longer express their opinions. They could no longer gather in groups. They could no longer talk on the telephone or send mail without the government being able to listen in or read their words. The government could search their houses whenever they wanted and take anything they wanted. These new laws gave the Nazis almost unlimited power. They could now persecute and harm groups of people without technically breaking any German laws. After the Nazis changed their constitution, they used the press to further control the population. People could no longer read any news except what the Nazis wanted them to read. What the Nazis approved was usually false. The way the news was written made the Nazis and their views look good and right, while people from different ethnic, religious, and political groups were portrayed as evil and inhuman. They also controlled what was broadcast over the radio and what was shown at movie theaters. They burned books they didn't agree with, including religious books and artwork they thought was inappropriate. These changes helped the Nazis execute their plan of widespread persecution across Germany and the countries that they conquered during World War II. The Nazi government hasn't been the only one to try to control the press. Countries such as China, North Korea, Iran, and Vietnam do not allow freedom of the press for their people. Reporters Without Borders was assembled to a map that shows what countries have the most and least restrictions on freedom of the press. The people who live in the countries in red and dark orange have very few freedoms to write what they want, and the government controls the information they receive. Although people in the United States have the right to a free press, they do not have the right to print what they know is a lie. This type of writing is called liberal, and because it can harm other people, it is against the law. To assemble means to gather in groups. With this freedom, people can get together with other people and talk about ideas. They can protest things they don't agree with. They just have to do so peacefully. Depending on where they want to gather, they may also need to get a permit. If you live in the United States and the government does something you don't like, you can tell the government how you feel. You can write a letter to any leader and express your feelings. In the 1700s, the colonists tried to do this when they disagreed with the laws of King George III. Instead of listening to their grievances, the king passed more laws to punish the colonists. Since the colonists didn't have any say in what laws were passed, they had no representatives in the British government. There was very little they could do. That was the main reason they fought for their freedom in the Revolutionary War. Today, you can petition the government whenever you want. If you don't like something that has happened in your town, you can go to a city council meeting and speak in front of the leaders. You can also write a letter to the mayor and explain your views. Not only can you write to the leaders of your town, but you can also write or call the leaders of your country, state, or your county, state, or nation. The Bill of Rights, one of the most important documents of the U.S. government, has protected the rights of Americans for more than 200 years. Because it has been so helpful, it has been used on the basis for similar bills of rights for other countries and for international law. Because of the human rights violations that happened during World War II, after the war, the leaders of the victorious nations agreed that a Bill of Rights was necessary for all people everywhere. The United Nations was established in 1945 in order to curb warfare and to protect human rights around the world. In December 1948, the General Assembly of the United Nations agreed on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It included 30 groups of rights. Do some of these rights sound similar to the ones found in the U.S. Bill of Rights? How about the cruel punishment, fair hearing, and freedom of religion? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights has helped protect people around the world. However, there still are many countries that refuse to give people basic human rights. The goal of the United Nations is to eventually have every country on earth value the rights of its people more than the power of its government. It's likely the framers of the U.S. Constitution would be proud to know that their work has inspired freedom-loving people around the world. They'd probably also be pleased to know that after the Bill of Rights was ratified, 17 more amendments were added. The ability to add new amendments to the Constitution allows the government to adapt to the times and needs of the people. The difficult amendment process ensures that the Constitution remains unchanged unless absolutely necessary.